Ever notice how with old books, sometimes it's not even the main story that grabs you at first?
Oh, no.
It's those little notes at the beginning, like a dedication to some duke or a rambling preface.
You get that feeling.
Like you're peeking behind the curtain? Or...
Totally. Like a little time capsule, right?
Yeah.
You get the author's voice.
Yeah.
All those hopes and fears, all that stuff from centuries ago.
And that's exactly what we're doing in this deep dive today.
That's right.
Unearthing a digitized copy on Google Books. This one's called The English Fencing Master, or The Complete Tutorer of the Small Sword, printed way back in 1729.
Wow.
Now, you hear fencing manual, you might think, okay, super niche topic.
Right.
But trust me, just from the dedication and preface alone, I'm telling you, some seriously cool glimpses into the past.
Absolutely. And, so often we just jump right into the meat of these old books.
Yeah.
But for this deep dive, we're going to really linger in those opening greetings, the dedication, the preface. See what they tell us about the author, who he thought you, the reader, might be, and that world he lived in. Like literary time travel.
I love it. Okay, so the book opens with a dedication, right? And it's addressed to this guy, Charles Tryon, Esquire of Bulwick in Northamptonshire. Quite a mouthful.
Right.
The author, Henry Blackwell, starts off super polite, almost like overly humble, apologizing for even connecting Tryon's awful name to so worthless a trifle.
Wow. What strikes you about that?
I mean, it's a level of deference, right? It's so formal.
Oh, totally. But that was just the standard way of doing dedications back then. I mean, authors were always trying to get support, right?
Right.
Or at least approval. They'd go all out, showing respect to someone they admired, someone who could help them out.
Yeah.
Remember, awful here doesn't mean bad. It means, like, inspiring awe.
Gotcha.
So it's more like Blackwell is saying, my esteemed Mr. Tryon, please forgive my boldness, that sort of thing.
Right. Setting the tone. But then he explains why he's dedicating the book to this guy. Right. He says he couldn't find anyone more capable of giving protection to his book and himself from the obloquy and detraction of malicious and envious men.
That's interesting.
I mean, that sounds a bit intense for a fencing manual.
Right. It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, why would someone writing about sword fighting expect such a harsh reaction?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if there were some controversial things going on around publishing these kinds of books back then.
Yeah.
Maybe different schools of thought on fencing or criticisms from other experts, even the public, like a more complex world of martial arts instruction than we'd think.
Yeah, that makes sense. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
He starts praising Tryon, talking about his ability to parry and put by the secret stabs and thrusts of the most vigilant adversary.
Oh, nice.
You catch those fencing terms, he's using them metaphorically.
Yeah.
Then he goes on to list all these great qualities of Tryon's. Loyalty, religion, goodness, generosity, you name it.
He's really laying it on thick. But I think what's really clever is how he weaves in the language of fencing. Like, he's directly connecting Tryon's personality to the actual skill the book's teaching.
Right.
Suggesting that Tryon embodies the strategic thinking, the finesse, even in his everyday life.
Oh, I see, yeah. Like, he's not just a good swordsman, he's a good man.
Exactly. It shows you how authors would tailor their praise to the book's topic.
Right. But then, almost as quickly as he starts, he kind of pulls back. He says, "But lest, while I am speaking these great truths, I should seem to flatter, a thing I know you detest, I must, with the historian Manu de Tabula, proceed no further on that head."
Oh, I love that. Manu de Tabula.
What does that even mean?
It's Latin for enough of this subject.
Okay.
Like, he's aware he might be overdoing it,
Yeah.
Trying to come across as sincere,
Yeah.
not just a brown-noser.
Yeah.
And throwing in that Latin phrase
Yeah.
adds a bit of that scholarly air, showing off a bit for Tryon, maybe.
Okay, that makes sense. Then comes this whole bit where he basically apologizes for how the book is written, blaming his, and I quote, inartificial way of expressing myself, the improper words and epithets, on a lack of better and more liberal education.
Wow, that's pretty self-deprecating, isn't it?
Yeah, you don't see authors doing that much anymore.
True, but back then, it wasn't uncommon. Especially for authors who maybe didn't come from privilege. It could be a genuine feeling about his education. Or, maybe it's another strategy, trying to gain sympathy, lower expectations for the writing.
Play the underdog card.
Exactly.
But then, after all that apology for his writing, he gets to the actual content. He says he hopes the account I have here given of that noble Gentile and most ancient art, and the rules he lays out are so plain and intelligible that the work won't suffer from a lack of rhetorical and ornamental flourishes.
So basically, he's saying the writing might not be fancy, but the fencing advice is solid.
Exactly. Like, don't judge a book by its cover, or in this case, its preface.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it really points to who he thinks his audience is, right? Probably gentlemen who want to learn to fence, not read some flowery prose.
Right, right.
So he's emphasizing clarity, practicality over style, and maybe even hinting that he wants to make this skill accessible to more people, not just the highly educated.
Okay, I see. Then he finishes up the dedication by saying he doesn't care who dislikes it as long as Tryon approves.
Oh, interesting.
Because Tryon, he says, is a competent judge in this case. Like, he really wants that stamp of approval from the right person.
Absolutely. I mean, it highlights how strategic this dedication is. Tryon's endorsement would basically give the book instant credibility.
Right.
And potentially shield Blackwell from all those malicious and envious men he mentioned earlier. You know,
Yeah.
This is how things worked back then.
Yeah, it's all about who you know, I guess. Or who knows you.
Exactly.
Then it ends with a big flowery wish for Tryon's long life and eventual translation to a better place. Signed, your most humble and obedient servant, Henry Blackwell.
So polite.
Right. Very formal. You get the sense of this power dynamic, right?
Totally. You know, it gives us a little peek into how people communicated back then. All those social structures, those formal ways of seeking favor, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so we've covered the dedication, this very formal address.
Right.
Now, Blackwell includes a preface where he speaks directly to the reader.
Okay.
And right off the bat, he says he could very willingly have saved myself the trouble of a preface had I not lain under a necessity of apologizing for the brevity of this undertaking. Basically, he's apologizing for the book being short.
That is interesting. What do you make of that?
Well, it kind of implies that long, comprehensive books were the expectation, right?
Yeah, maybe the norm.
So he feels the need to explain why he went for a shorter approach.
Right. Setting the stage for you, the reader. Hey, don't worry, it's short, but it's good.
Yeah, and he does go on to reassure the reader, saying that there is scarce anything needful to the knowledge of the small sword, which is not here laid down, and that in so plain and clear a method as will give both satisfaction and delight to all lovers of this art.
Okay, so he's promising it's complete, easy to understand, efficient, basically.
Exactly. And in a time when gentlemen probably had a ton of stuff going on, a guide that was both thorough and to the point.
Must have been really appealing.
Oh, for sure. And notice he mentions satisfaction and delight.
Oh, yeah.
Like, he wants the learning process to be enjoyable, too.
Not just a chore. He gets it.
Yeah. And then he hits you with this. An art so necessary to be known and so proper a qualification for the constituting a man a gentleman that I had almost said he can be none that is not skilled therein.
Wow.
Basically saying, if you want to be considered a true gentleman, you gotta know how to use a small sword.
Yeah, it really shows you how central fencing was to their world, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about fighting. It was tied up with ideas of honor, social status, what it meant to be a man in that society.
Yeah, like a must-have skill.
Absolutely. Right up there with riding horses and dancing.
Essential gentlemanly pursuits.
Exactly.
Okay, so then he gets into why the book is so concise. He says he's using but a few lessons, believing this to be most practicable.
Makes sense.
His argument is that too many lessons are rather cloying than instructive, and that gentlemen are apt to forget one while they are learning another, by which means they scarce ever become perfect in any.
That's actually a pretty astute observation about learning in general, don't you think?
Oh, totally. Like, he understands teaching, the limitations of memory. He's basically advocating for a focused, step-by-step approach, which in a way feels very modern, right?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Like recognizing that information overload can be a real problem.
Right. And then he throws in this little tidbit mentioning that he could have gone on and on about how great English sword fighting is and show you particularly how England of late years has exceeded all other countries herein, even France itself.
A little bit of national pride there.
Definitely. And maybe a hint of rivalry with France.
Oh, absolutely. Remember, both England and France had this long fencing tradition,
Right.
and national pride played a big role in how those skills were viewed. So him saying England surpassed France,
Yeah.
that suggests a shift in who they saw as the top dogs in swordsmanship.
Interesting. But then he kind of brushes that whole point aside, saying it's rather the work of a panegyric than a swordsman.
So he's not going to get bogged down in bragging. He wants to stay focused on the practical stuff.
Exactly. Teaching you how to fence, not boasting about national superiority.
Keeping it real.
Yeah. And then, to wrap up the preface, he says, if this edition finds acceptance in the world, I intend to enlarge on this and other parts of it and oblige all lovers hereof with a complete system in a second edition.
So he's thinking about a sequel already.
Right. Confident this one's going to be a hit.
That's right. And it suggests this first edition might be more of an introduction, you know?
Yeah, makes sense. And he signs off simply with his initials, HB.
Much more casual than the dedication.
Right. So what do you think, having gone through all of this, what does this deep dive into the dedication and preface tell us?
Well, for me, it really shows the layers of information you can unpack from these seemingly simple parts of the book.
Yeah.
Like, you see Blackwell navigating the social expectations, being super formal with the dedication,
Right.
but then connecting with the reader directly in the preface.
Yeah.
And we get a sense of just how important fencing was back then. Not just a hobby, but a marker of social status, a core part of being a gentleman.
Yeah, and Blackwell clearly believes he can teach it well, even in a shorter format.
Exactly. He's confident in his expertise.
And it makes you think about all these little details, like who are those malicious and envious men he mentioned in the dedication? What kind of criticism could a fencing instructor even face back then? And why apologize so much for his writing style?
Yeah, especially when he's clearly so knowledgeable about fencing. It's like he's caught between these social expectations and his own expertise.
Right. And it makes you wonder about those social barriers, how much formal education mattered back then. But at the same time, he's saying, hey, practical knowledge is valuable too.
Exactly. It's a really fascinating glimpse into those social dynamics.
And it makes you realize that sometimes the most interesting stuff isn't hidden deep within the text.
Right.
It's right there in the parts we often skip over, like the dedication and preface.
Absolutely. It reminds us to pay attention to the framing, the context of any work, whether it's an old fencing manual or something we're reading today. The introductions can tell us so much.
Exactly. So if you're intrigued by this little peek into the world of 18th century fencing and all its social complexities, maybe seek out the full text of The English Fencing Master. See what else you can uncover in those digitized pages.
That's a great suggestion.
Because sometimes the most formal introductions hold the most surprising insights.
You just need to take that deep dive.
Exactly.